You're on 94.1 FM 3WBC with Jerry Guirguis presenting the Egypt Australia Radio Show, a weekly English edition covering local and international news sourced from Australia, Egypt and the Greater Middle East and North Africa region. The program affectionately covers the arts, culture, trade and politics. And now here's Jerry Guirguis presenting the Egypt Australia Radio Show, 94.1 FM 3WBC, the voice of the Inner East.
Please welcome Kyle J. Anderson, Assistant Professor, Department of History and Philosophy, SUNY Old Westbury, New York, USA. He's taught Islamic cultures, making history, topics in Islamic civilization. His interest and research is in social history, World War I, colonialism and anti-colonial movements. He's also the author, and the reason why I have Kyle on Zoom today is because he's the author of the book Egyptian Labour Corps, Race, Space and Place in the First World War. Hi Kyle and welcome to 94.1 FM 3WBC Egypt Australia Radio Show.
Hey Jerry, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Kyle, I just want to go back in time in between Egypt in 1882 to 1888.
Sure.
The question I have for you, sir, is that when did the British form Egyptian Labour Corps, the ELC, and or the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, the EEF?
Well, the Egyptian Labor Corps and the EEF, the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, were both founded in World War I, actually. Yeah. So the Egyptian Labor Corps was first getting recruited in early 1915. Yep. And the Egyptian Expeditionary Force was founded in the middle of 1916, or maybe around the spring of 1916. Right. So, before that, the British may have relied on some Egyptian labor, especially down in the Sudan campaigns, which were going on against the so-called Mahdi in the 1880s. Maybe if you've seen the book or the movie about Charles Gordon, right? Chinese Gordon, who was down there in Sudan. You might have seen that movie with Charlton Heston. Talks a little bit about the Egyptian forces, the troops that were being used, but those were actually from the Egyptian army. So the Egyptian Labor Corps is distinct from the Egyptian army. And it was really part of the British Army, the British Imperial Army, as it engaged in battles during First World War.
Right. Okay. If we go to stick to that period in 1882, did the British and the Tewfik of Egypt upheld their control over Egypt in 1882 against Ahmed Orabi, the revolution of 1882?
Right. So Ahmed Orabi was a colonel in the Egyptian army who came to represent a revolutionary movement in Egypt that was taking place really starting in the late 1870s. Over time, this movement became more and more threatening to the British in their eyes. Yep. And one of the key events that sparked the British occupation of Egypt was a riot that took place in Alexandria in 1882, which led to the shelling of Alexandria by British naval forces who were docked outside of the city. And after that, the British launched a short war in Egypt around August, September of 1882, going against Orabi's forces, who were encamped in Kafr al-Duar, which is a region of Egypt in the Delta. And they were turned back by the Arabist forces, and then they had to invade again. They came through the Sinai Peninsula near the Suez Canal. And in that second wave, the British were successful. They defeated the Arabist forces at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir in September of 1882. And shortly thereafter, the British really established, an occupation, a military occupation of Egypt. So before 1882, the British certainly had an important influence over the Egyptian government. They had established in the 1870s some control over the budget and the finances of the Egyptian government. But it wasn't until 1882 that the British established their military occupation. And that was, as you mentioned, with the support of the Khedive Tewfik. This was a Khedive that was, the Khedive is the term, by the way, for the hereditary ruler of Egypt while it was under the Ottoman Empire, right? So before 1882, and even after 1882, Egypt was legally under Ottoman control, right? The Ottoman sovereignty. However, the British were allies with the Ottomans and had a way of influencing the Ottoman Sultan. And so as this crisis was unfolding with Ahmed Orabi, the British convinced the Ottoman Sultan to depose the ruler of Egypt and install his son, which was Tewfik. And Tewfik was seen, therefore, as kind of a stooge for the British Empire. And so Tewfik continued to technically, legally rule Egypt until 1892. But because he was so sort of indebted to the British for putting him in this position in the first place, it was really kind of a fig leaf for what was actually British occupation. And gradually, over the next 30 or so years, the British expanded their ability to control the Egyptian government by seizing different ministries in the Egyptian government and installing their own advisors into these ministries and pushing through a series of reforms that would allow for these ministries to have more and more control and power within Egypt. So it's a complex story, but it's really starting in 1882 that the British established their military occupation.
I have to say, as an adult now, I'm learning quite a deal about it, and I do thank you so much for allocating the time and your wonderful book. Kyle, I want to move to November 1914. The Australian Imperial Force sailed to Egypt in 1940. When did the ELC or the EEF start digging trenches at the Gallipoli Cove, ANZAC, what we know now as ANZAC Cove, before the Australian and British got there?
Right. So in November of 1914, the British are already planning their Gallipoli invasion.
Yep.
And they choose Alexandria, Egypt, as the headquarters for what's known at that time as the MEF, or the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force.
Yep.
And the MEF goes from Alexandria. It has some bases on some Greek islands called Lemnos and Imbros, and they begin their amphibious assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula right around February of 1915. So at that point, that's when the British start to establish the Egyptian Labor Corps. But the EEF doesn't exist yet. It's all the MEF at this point, and the ANZAC battalions are part of the MEF. Now, at that point, it makes sense that the British would be recruiting laborers from Egypt because, as I mentioned, Alexandria is the headquarters of the MEF, right? So what the British are doing is simply trying to find the most practical way of recruiting laborers. They go nearby, right? Who's living near the headquarters? It's the Egyptians. And so this process of recruiting Egyptians begins through the labor contracting system. They recruit migrant laborers who would have been used in business projects, construction projects.
Yeah.
So usually from the south of Egypt, south of Alexandria, but also the deep south of Egypt. These migrant laborers are used to moving up north during the dry season in the south and looking for work wherever they can find it, whether that's agricultural work or construction work or working for a business.
Yeah.
Well, the British start to contract with these labor contractors who are working for construction workers and entrepreneurs usually, and they say, hey, can you find some laborers for us to help our army, our effort to invading Gallipoli? Now, most of these laborers probably did not know what they were getting themselves into when they initially joined the ELC, right? They thought most likely that they were just going to do some of their normal migrant work the way they would have in Cairo or in the agricultural estates of the Delta. But as these men discovered, the British had bigger plans for them. They put them on ships and they sent them to Gallipoli, first to Lemnos and Imbros, and these migrant laborers were engaged in building wharves and docks to help the ships, unload their supplies. Also, you have to remember that back in these days, they didn't have shipping containers, right? So nowadays, when we want to supply or move supplies on ships, we load them into shipping containers, and we have big machines that move these shipping containers from the land onto the ship. But in this day, that's before the invention of the shipping container. So what you have is a lot of people moving supplies by hand, right? Boxes of supplies by hand. So it takes a lot more labor to load and unload ships in 1915 than it does today, right? And so a lot of these men are, you have, thousands. Maybe, I think I estimated in my book, maybe 3,000, probably less than 5,000 in the ELC engaged in the beginning of 1915, first loading and unloading ships and building these docks in Lemnos and Imbros. And then once the amphibious assault on Gallipoli is launched, then the Egyptians start to actually go onto the Gallipoli Peninsula and dig trenches and build warehouses and fortifications for the MEF, which includes these ANZAC battalions, as they're trying to invade Gallipoli. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. Carl, I was actually really fascinated. I was intrigued by the fact that there was, part of the Egyptians under the British being at Gallipoli Cove, what we call ANZAC Cove. And today is literally ANZAC Day. So we commemorate ANZAC just 5 minutes ago, and not far from here is the centre. So that's very interesting. We move to the March of 1916, Carl. The British and correct me if I'm wrong, sir, the EEF are deployed to both the Western Front and both West and Eastern Front and the Gaza Palestinian theatre there. Did the British form the EEF from the ELC? And I think you've touched on that before.
Yeah. So the British get the idea to form the EEF kind of after the Gallipoli campaign fails, right? They relocate the MEF, which includes the ANZAC battalions, back to Alexandria. And at the time, the Ottoman Empire, which is allied with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as you know, is engaged in a series of invasions into the Sinai Peninsula. They're trying to attack the Suez Canal. And so the EEF is formed after the failure of the Gallipoli campaigns to help defend the Suez Canal against these Ottoman attacks. And it includes the ANZAC battalions that have been relocated from the failed Gallipoli campaign. And it also includes a lot of Indian, South Asian troops who would have been engaged in fighting on the Western Front, which is in France and Belgium, right? After they end up not having a lot of success there, they've never been trained with machine guns, they're not used to fighting in the winter. The British decide to relocate those Indian and South Asian troops to Egypt, right? Egypt is kind of a central location in the British Empire. If you think about how it stretches around. So the reason why Egypt is important is because it's kind of a base, a central base where the Australians can come, the Indians can come, also Europeans can come, and those Australians and Indians who go to Europe can turn back around and go to Egypt. Of course, Egypt has the Suez Canal, which is kind of the major artery of the British Empire at this time. So the British, so if we get our timeline right, the ELC is founded in early 1915 to help the MEF, the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, launch its invasion in Gallipoli. That invasion fails. The MEF relocates to Egypt. It joins up with these Indian and South Asian troops from France and Belgium. And the British have this idea that, hey, these ELC troops, sure, the Gallipoli invasion didn't work out, but these Egyptians showed that they could do a lot of work. So, and they could do it well. They could do it just as well as, British troops. They would have called them white troops at the time, right? And so they decide to expand the Egyptian labor corps. They decide to recruit even more laborers through this contract labor system that I talked about. And it's gradually, not until really the end of 1916, that the Egyptian Expeditionary Force starts to push into, ultimately towards Palestine, right? They got to go through the Sinai Peninsula, and then they try to invade Palestine. So the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, it's made up of Australians and Indians. The ELC is not exactly part of that because they're not fighting. The Egyptians are not fighting at this point, right? The ELC is distinct from the army. They're just doing the work. They're moving supplies from one place to another. In the Sinai Peninsula in particular, there's no roads at this time. It's a big desert. So the Egyptian Labor Corps is engaged in building a railroad to help connect the railroad in the Suez Canal up into Palestine and help move supplies. And they're also engaged in, before the railroad is finished, they're driving camels, because the main way that you transport supplies through the desert before you have a railroad is on the backs of camels. So that's when the Egyptian Expeditionary Force is formed. It starts to chase the Ottomans into Sinai and ultimately up into Palestine. And the ELC is supporting them kind of behind the lines, building the supply lines that the EEF needs as it's engaged in fighting with the Ottomans, the combined Ottoman-German force in the Sinai.
Oh, I'm just going to go very slowly at the next question, only because, so 1916, in June 1916, 25,000 Turkish troops crossed the Sinai. They got close to the Suez Canal, 25 k's out of the Suez Canal, and we know that as being the Romani theatre there. The Turkish forces commanded by the Germans Colonel Press, comprising mainly of Arabs from Damascus and Bedouins. 1917, Fuad, who's the Hussein Kamal's brother, is in charge of Egypt under the British. By the end of 28th of October 1918, the Turkish government signed an armistice and surrendered outright 2 years later. Then, this is leading up to the next question, Kyle. We get into March till April 1919, and that's the Egyptian Revolution, and you've talked about that in your video, and that's talking about the times of Saad Zaghloul, the Waft, the nationalists against the British, where the British, Australian, supposedly, EEF, slaughtered 3,000 uprisings. Did the British, my question for you, sir, did the British repeat their military tactics by deploying the same force used back in 1882, because they've had that practice before, against the Orabi Revolution back in 1882, to repeat it back again in 1919? So, and just, protect the colonization scenario.
Well, there are some similarities in the sense that the British forces are deployed within Egypt. Like I said, the Orabi troops were able to hold off the British in Kafr al-Duwar, and then they ultimately were unable to hold off the British at Tel el-Kebir in September of 1882. In this case, though, what's different is that the British forces are not fighting against the Egyptian army, which is what Ahmed Orabi was commanding at the time.
Yes.
They're fighting against Egyptian civilians who are engaged in demonstrations. We might call them, perhaps riots or, large protests that in some cases took over whole cities for a while, like Asyut, for example, was a place where there were many Egyptians who kind of, had a part of the city that they basically controlled for a few weeks. And so what the British did when this was happening was they ordered battalions of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, which had just successfully invaded through the Sinai into Palestine and Syria. They turned them around and told them, go into Egypt. The Australians were particularly important in this regard because the role that the Australians played in the EEF was as light horsemen, right? So they were kind of the cavalry of the EEF. And what this meant was that they were more mobile than infantry. And the British turned around and they sent a number of Australian light horsemen. I believe the number is about 20,000 soldiers to go through Egypt and put down these demonstrations, put down these protests that were going on. One of the big things the protesters did was they damaged the railway lines. They cut off the telegraph lines. And so what this meant is that it was hard to travel around the countryside of Egypt down to Asyut, which, as you know, is about 125 miles or so south of Cairo, right? So it's pretty far away. And so so this is what's different, right? They didn't have, in the case of Orabi, they didn't have cavalry horses who were going down there. Another big difference is by the time that 1919 rolls around, the Royal Air Force has been established during the First World War. And so the Royal Air Force gets unleashed on these crowds as well. And there's documents that I've found in the British archives talking about how these Royal Air Force planes, bombed and machine gunned crowds of protesters who were engaged in sabotaging railroads and telegraph lines. So while it's similar in the sense that the British Army is deployed within Egypt, it's different because the army is fighting civilians. It's not fighting another army. It's going deeper into Egypt. It's going down to the south of Egypt, where the troops, they never fought in the south against Orabi, and they have Air Force, which didn't exist in 1882. And it was a very new technology at the time, and it was used to deadly effect to help put down these Egyptian crowds. It's similar but different.
It's taken me so many years, Kyle, to understand the Australian grudge against the Egyptians, and I think you summed it up.
So one of the things that's important to understand is that while the Australians were engaged in fighting against the Ottomans in the Sinai and Syria, they were also on R&R, rest and relaxation, right? And they would go back to Cairo, and they would go back to Alexandria, and they would hang out, right? And back in these days, prostitution is legal in Egypt, for example. So a lot of these Australians are hanging out in the brothels, partying, going to the bars. And there's a famous riot that takes place led by Australian soldiers in 1915 in Cairo, right? So in my mind, the place where you would have seen a lot of interaction between Australians and Egyptians would have been not in battle, but on R&R, right? When they go back to Cairo, when they go back to Alexandria, and they are living side by side with these Egyptians. But even when they're in battle, they would have seen what they called the LCs, right? The members of the ELC. They have little nicknames for everybody. So there are, many records of Australians talking about the LCs, and they would have been. I mean, these laborers were clearly in a subordinate position, right? And the British called them part of the colored labor corps. So it was still very much thought about in racial terms, right? That these Egyptians are somehow, racially inferior to the white troops and officers who are leading the army. And I think, there's a lot of pejorative words that the Australians and the British would have used to refer to these Egyptians that indicates the sort of dehumanization of these Egyptians, not seen as full equals to the officers and the troops who were doing the fighting. This is one of the reasons why the Egyptians were just laborers and never allowed to take up arms, because they were seen as a certain type of people who was appropriate for a certain type of role in the army, and they couldn't be officers, for example. And they were flogged, whereas I believe the British Army at least outlawed flogging of British troops in the 19th century. This is, up into the early 20th century, and whips and flogging is one of the ways that the officers of the ELC tried to enforce discipline, and the officers were always white. So you would have had groups of about 500 to 1,000 Egyptian laborers with a commanding officer who's usually British, and then a few NCOs, non-commissioned officers, who might have been different nationalities and ethnicities. But it was always a white British man commanding a group of what they would call colored laborers.
Paul, I have to wrap it there, but I think it gives me another opportunity to talk to you further more about the Greek historian Thucydides, and he talks about the establishing powers are threatened by the rising powers. And we talk about Mr. and Mrs. Bouquet. Do you remember Mrs. Bouquet? Keeping up with appearances. In relations, and we'll have a chat about that, capitalism, of course, class system and elite. So I'll really need to have a stop there, but I want to thank you, Kyle. Absolutely. Thank you sincerely for allocating the time, which I look forward to our next chat.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, anytime. Let me know. I'm happy to chat again.